James Carter had never doubted that family was supposed to stand by each other, no matter what. Growing up, his father, Richard Carter, had built a thriving real estate business from the ground up, transforming a modest investment into a multi-million-dollar empire. His mother, Margaret, had been the pillar of the family, ensuring that their home was warm and welcoming. James, along with his younger siblings, Mark and Emily, had enjoyed a privileged upbringing, attending the best schools and never wanting for anything. But despite their shared childhood, James had always been different from his siblings. While Mark and Emily basked in the comfort of their wealth, taking their father's success for granted, James had worked hard to forge his own path. He had pursued a degree in accounting, determined to be independent rather than relying on the family fortune. By the time their father fell ill, James had built a successful career in finance. He had his own consulting firm, a steady client base, and financial security that didn't depend on the Carter wealth. Still, he remained close to his father, visiting him often in the hospital, discussing business strategies, and sharing moments of quiet reflection. Richard had always respected James's independence, often telling him, "You're the one who truly understands the value of hard work." James took pride in that. He never expected favoritism in the inheritance, but he assumed his father would be fair. When Richard passed away, grief consumed the entire family. The funeral was grand, attended by business associates, family friends, and community leaders. James delivered a heartfelt eulogy, speaking not about wealth or success, but about the values his father had instilled in him: honesty, perseverance, and responsibility. His siblings, however, seemed more focused on the business implications of their father's death. Mark, who had worked under their father but never truly shouldered any responsibility, spoke confidently about stepping up as the new head of the company. Emily, who had never worked a day in her life but enjoyed the prestige of being a Carter, spoke vaguely about honoring Dad's legacy. James, for his part, believed that with proper leadership, the company could continue to thrive. He wasn't interested in running it himself, but he was willing to offer his financial expertise to ensure stability. 2 weeks later, the family gathered for the reading of the will. James walked into the attorney's office expecting a fair division of assets, perhaps a portion of the business, some real estate, or at least a financial share. Instead, he sat in stunned silence as the attorney read the terms. Everything, the company, the properties, and the family estate, was left to Margaret, Mark, and Emily. James's name wasn't mentioned at all. For a moment, he thought there had been a mistake. He looked around the room, expecting confusion from his mother and siblings, but he found only discomfort. Margaret avoided his gaze, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Emily studied her nails, pretending to be absorbed in some insignificant detail. Mark, however, met his eyes with a look that was almost smug. "I don't understand," James finally said, his voice steady but cold. "Why am I not included?" Margaret exhaled slowly. "James, your father and I discussed this. You have your own success, your own business. You don't need this the way Mark and Emily do." His stomach tightened. "That's not the point. It's not about need. It's about fairness." Mark leaned forward, his tone patronizing. "Come on, James. You've always been the independent one. Dad knew you didn't want to be tied down by the family business. This just makes sense." James clenched his jaw. He could see it now. The decision hadn't been made by his father. His father had always valued fairness. This was his mother's doing, likely pushed by Mark and Emily. He turned to the attorney. Was this his original will? The attorney hesitated, glancing at Margaret before answering. "Your father amended his will 6 months before his passing. It was signed and notarized properly." 6 months. That was when his father had been at his weakest, when Margaret had taken full control of his care. James had been visiting regularly, but during those final months, his father had been on heavy medication. Could he have been coerced into signing? Or had Margaret convinced him that James didn't need anything? He knew better than to ask. Challenging the will would be costly, drawn out, and would only damage his father's legacy further. James stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "I see," he said evenly. "I hope you all enjoy what you've taken." Margaret's expression turned pained. "James, please don't be like this. We're still family." He let out a bitter laugh. "Are we? Because right now it feels like I was just cut out of it." Without another word, he walked out, leaving behind the people who had once been his closest family. The betrayal burned, not because of the money, but because of what it represented. His own mother and siblings had deemed him unworthy, had chosen greed over fairness. That night he sat in his apartment, replaying the moment in his head, wondering if he had been a fool all along to believe that family meant more than wealth. Over the next few months, he distanced himself. His mother called occasionally, leaving messages about family gatherings, but he ignored them. Mark and Emily never reached out, not that he expected them to. He focused on his business, expanding his consulting firm, pouring his energy into something that was truly his. Years passed, and the pain dulled into cold resolve. He had built something on his own, something that no one could take from him, and as far as he was concerned, he had no family left. Mark and Emily had always believed that wealth was an endless resource, something that would always be there no matter how recklessly they spent it. When their father had been alive, he had kept a tight rein on finances, ensuring that the family's real estate empire remained profitable and secure. But after his passing, with their mother Margaret's blind trust and willingness to fund their every whim, the business slowly began to crumble. At the age of 90, at first everything seemed fine. Mark, now the official head of the Carter Real Estate Company, presented himself as a confident leader, telling employees and investors that he was continuing his father's vision. In reality, he was nothing more than an overgrown child playing CEO. He lacked the discipline, the business acumen, and most importantly, the ability to listen to advisors who actually knew what they were doing. He surrounded himself with yes-men, pushing out the older, experienced managers who had worked alongside their father for years. Mark was convinced he could take the company in a new direction, which, in his mind, meant aggressive expansion, risky investments, and excessive spending. Emily, on the other hand, had no real interest in the business itself. She had never worked a day in her life and had no intention of starting now. With her inheritance secured, she threw herself into a lavish lifestyle of expensive vacations, designer shopping sprees, and high-profile social events. She bought a penthouse in Manhattan, an oceanfront villa in Miami, and a collection of luxury cars she barely knew how to drive. She hosted extravagant parties, making sure the Carter name remained associated with wealth and prestige, but, behind the scenes, the financial strain was beginning to show. Margaret, despite being the matriarch of the family, was either unwilling or unable to rein her children in. She had always been soft on them, believing that money was meant to be enjoyed rather than hoarded. She continued to fund their excesses, ignoring warnings from the company's remaining financial advisors that they were bleeding cash. She assured herself that Mark knew what he was doing, that everything would be fine, and that their father's legacy would endure. But reality was far less forgiving. The first cracks in the foundation appeared when several of Mark's investments failed spectacularly. He had poured millions into high-risk real estate deals, convinced that the market would always work in his favor. He over-leveraged the company, taking out massive loans to finance new developments, assuming that returns would be immediate. But when a major project stalled due to permit issues and another fell through due to mismanagement, the financial strain became undeniable. Lost suddenly, banks that had once been eager to work with the Carter family were tightening their terms. Creditors who had once offered favorable deals began calling in debts. At first, Mark dismissed the warnings. "It's just a temporary setback," he told his board of directors, brushing off concerns. "We've hit rough patches before. We just need time." Time, however, was not on their side. The company's cash reserves dwindled faster than expected. Payroll became a concern, with employees quietly expressing fears about delayed salaries. Longtime investors grew uneasy, and rumors began circulating that Carter Real Estate was in trouble. Mark, in his arrogance, refused to acknowledge the severity of the situation. Instead of tightening spending and focusing on stabilizing the business, he doubled down. He borrowed even more money, gambling on one last big deal that he believed would turn everything around. When that too collapsed, the company found itself in a full-blown financial crisis. Emily, oblivious as ever, continued living as if nothing had changed. It wasn't until her credit cards started getting declined and luxury brands began cutting off her lines of credit that she realized something was wrong. Panicked, she turned to Mark, demanding answers. He, for the first time, had no comforting lies to offer. Margaret, upon finally seeing the financial reports in black and white, was devastated. The company her husband had built was on the verge of bankruptcy. The family's personal assets were deeply entangled in the business, meaning that if things continued on this path, they would not only lose the company, but also their homes, their properties, everything. Desperation set in. The Carters were no longer the untouchable elite. They were now hounded by creditors, avoided by former business partners, and quietly mocked by those who had once admired their wealth. The media caught wind of their troubles, speculating articles speculating on the downfall of the Carter empire. The more they tried to control the narrative, the worse things got. Mark, overwhelmed and out of his depth, started drinking more heavily. Emily, unable to cope with the thought of losing her lifestyle, had multiple breakdowns, isolating herself from her once glamorous social circle. Margaret, guilt-ridden and terrified, realized that she had made a grave mistake in trusting her children to handle the fortune. In their darkest moment, they found themselves facing a harsh truth. They needed help, and the only person they could turn to was the one they had betrayed. James. Margaret was the first to suggest it. "We should talk to James," she said hesitantly over a tense family dinner. The mere mention of his name was enough to make Mark scowl and Emily roll her eyes. "Are you serious?" Mark scoffed. "After everything? He wants nothing to do with us." "He's the only one who might be able to fix this," Margaret insisted. "You know as well as I do that he understands finance better than any of us. He runs a successful business. If anyone can help us restructure, it's him." Emily let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, sure, we'll just go crawling back to the brother we screwed over and beg him to save us. That won't be humiliating at all." Margaret's voice was firm. "Humiliating or not, we have no choice." A heavy silence fell over them. Mark tapped his fingers against the table, deep in thought. He hated the idea, hated the thought of admitting failure to James, but he knew their mother was right. Without intervention, they would lose everything. Finally, with a reluctant sigh, he muttered, "Fine, but he's not going to make this easy for us." Emily crossed her arms, still resistant. "I doubt he'll even take our call." Margaret looked down at her hands. "Then we'll go to him in person." And so, the once proud Carter family, who had once cast James aside without a second thought, found themselves preparing to do something they never imagined. They were going to beg for his help. James Carter had moved on. In the years since his family had cut him out of the inheritance, he had built a life that was entirely his own. His financial consulting firm had grown steadily, earning him a reputation for being both strategic and pragmatic. He had a solid portfolio of clients, a comfortable home, and the peace of knowing that everything he had earned through his own hard work. Unlike Mark and Emily, he hadn't relied on a safety net of inherited wealth. He had never needed it. So when his phone buzzed one evening and he saw his mother's name flashing on the screen, he hesitated. It had been years since he had spoken to her beyond the occasional, awkward holiday message. He had ignored most of her calls, unwilling to reopen old wounds. But something about this one felt different. After a long pause, he answered. "James." Margaret's voice was strained, as if she had been crying. I know this is unexpected, but we need to talk. It's important." He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Is that so?" There was a brief silence before she continued. "Please, sweetheart, it's about the family business. About Mark and Emily. We need your help." James couldn't help but laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You need my help?" He repeated the words slowly, as if tasting them. "That's funny. The last time I checked, I wasn't part of the family anymore." "James, please," she pleaded. "We made a mistake. I made a mistake. But we don't have time to go back and fix the past. We're in trouble. Serious trouble." He could hear the desperation in her voice, but it didn't stir the sympathy she was likely hoping for. Instead, it confirmed what he had already suspected. They weren't reaching out because they missed him. They weren't apologizing because they had suddenly realized they had wronged him. They were drowning, and he was the last lifeline they could grab onto. Still, curiosity got the better of him. "How bad is it?" Margaret hesitated, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "We're about to lose everything." James let her words settle. He had kept an eye on the business over the years, though he had never openly admitted it. He knew things had been shaky, but he hadn't realized just how close they were to collapse. Part of him wanted to tell her it wasn't his problem, to hang up and leave them to their fate. But another part, perhaps the part that still carried remnants of family loyalty, wanted to hear more. "Come to my office tomorrow," he said finally, 8 a.m., and bring everything. Margaret exhaled in relief. "Thank you, James. You have no idea." "I'm not promising anything," he cut her off. "Just bring the numbers." The next morning, Margaret, Mark, and Emily arrived at his office. They looked different from the last time he had seen them. Margaret seemed older, as if the weight of the past few years had finally caught up to her. Mark had lost the arrogant swagger he once carried, his suit slightly disheveled, dark circles under his eyes. Emily, who had always been perfectly put together, looked fragile, as if she had been barely holding herself together. James gestured for them to sit as he spread out the financial reports they had brought. He didn't say anything at first, scanning through the numbers with the trained eye of someone who had spent years fixing other people's financial disasters. And this was a disaster. "What the hell were you thinking?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with disbelief. "Mark, you over-leveraged the company to the point of no return. You borrowed more money than you could ever hope to repay, and instead of stabilizing when things got bad, you gambled even more." Mark bristled. "I thought the investments would pay off." "You thought?" James repeated mockingly. "That's the problem. You didn't know. You didn't plan. You played CEO without having the slightest idea how to actually run a company." He turned to Emily. "And you? You bled through money like it was infinite. Lavish parties, unnecessary expenses, luxury properties that depreciated the moment you bought them. What exactly did you think was going to happen?" Emily looked away, her face burning with shame. I didn't think it would get this bad." James scoffed. "That much is obvious." Margaret placed a hand on his arm. "James, please. We know we messed up. We just need to know if there's a way to fix this." He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "The way I see it, you have two options. One, you file for bankruptcy, liquidate whatever assets you have left, and walk away with nothing." Emily flinched. "And the second option?" James's gaze hardened. "You give me full control." The room went silent. Mark looked like he had been slapped. "You want to take over the company?" "I don't want to," James corrected. "I don't need this. I have my own success, my own business. But if I'm going to clean up this mess, I'm doing it my way. That means no interference. You step down, completely. I take over, restructure, and salvage what's left. If I succeed, you won't lose everything, but make no mistake. If I do this, you don't get to call the shots anymore." Margaret looked between her children. Mark's pride was visibly wounded, but he knew he had no other choice. Emily, though reluctant, nodded slightly. Finally, Margaret turned back to James. "Okay," she whispered. "It's yours." James nodded, standing up. Good. Now get out of my office. I have work to do." As they left, James felt something he hadn't expected. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but a deep, quiet sense of justice. They had thrown him aside, believing they didn't need him, and now they were at his mercy. He wasn't going to let them forget it. James Carter wasted no time. The moment his family left his office, he set to work, diving into the wreckage that had once been the Carter real estate empire. He had seen financial disasters before, clients who had made poor investment choices, companies that had suffered from market downturns. But this was different. This was personal. For years, he had watched from the sidelines as Mark and Emily squandered everything their father had built. Now they were forced to put their fate in his hands, and James had no intention of letting their recklessness drag him down with them. The first step was triage. He spent the next week reviewing financial statements, meeting with creditors, and assessing which parts of the business could still be saved. What he found was worse than he had expected. Mark had taken out massive loans against the company's properties, leveraging them to finance risky developments that had either stalled or failed outright. The company was hemorrhaging money, unable to meet its debt obligations, and investor confidence had completely collapsed. Employees were panicked, and several key figures had already jumped ship, fearing the inevitable downfall. James knew that if he didn't act fast, the entire company would be beyond saving. The first thing he did was strip Mark and Emily of any remaining authority. He made it clear, publicly and legally, that they were no longer in control. Mark resisted at first, trying to argue that he could still be useful, but James shut him down quickly. "You had your chance," he told his brother coldly, "and you proved you weren't capable." With that settled, James turned his attention to restructuring. He called emergency meetings with the company's remaining leadership, bringing in his own team of financial analysts to assess what could be salvaged. He renegotiated debts, cut unnecessary expenses, and sold off failing properties to generate quick cash flow. He knew that to rebuild confidence, he had to move decisively. The hardest part was facing the investors. The Carter name had once been synonymous with stability and success, but now it was tainted by Mark's failures. Convincing them to stay on board was an uphill battle. Some had already written the company off as a lost cause. Others were willing to listen but demanded assurances that things would be different under James's leadership. And James gave them those assurances. He laid out a clear, detailed plan for recovery, showing them exactly how he would stabilize the business and return it to profitability. He promised transparency, efficiency, and, most importantly, competence, something that had been lacking under Mark's management. It wasn't easy, but slowly investors began to trust him. The changes weren't just on paper. James overhauled the company's internal operations, cutting out the excess that had accumulated under Mark and Emily's leadership. He streamlined costs, implemented strict financial oversight, and ensured that every dollar spent had a purpose. He rehired some of the experienced managers Mark had pushed out, bringing back the expertise the company had lost. It was brutal work, but it was necessary. Meanwhile, his family watched from the sidelines. Margaret, once so confident in Mark and Emily's abilities, had become a shadow of her former self. She had been forced to confront the reality of her mistakes, the realization that she had placed her trust in the wrong people. She tried to reach out to James several times, attempting to mend their relationship, but he kept his distance. He wasn't interested in apologies. Not yet. Emily, stripped of her wealth and influence, struggled to adjust to her new reality. The luxurious lifestyle she had once flaunted was gone, and with it the friends who had only ever cared about her money. She was bitter, angry, but most of all, lost. For the first time in her life, she had nothing to fall back on. And Mark resented James more than ever. Though he had no choice but to step aside, he hated seeing his brother succeed where he had failed. He tried to act as if he didn't care, but the truth was, James's takeover of the company was a direct reminder of his own shortcomings. Months passed. Under James's leadership, the company stabilized. It wasn't an overnight miracle, but little by little the damage was undone. The worst of the debts were managed, key properties were salvaged, and revenue streams began to recover. Employees, once fearful for their jobs, started to feel secure again. Investors who had doubted James now saw that he was exactly what the company had needed all along. The Carter empire had been saved. But James didn't stop there. He didn't just want to rescue the company. He wanted to ensure that Mark and Emily could never destroy it again. So he made his final move. He restructured ownership. Legally, Mark and Emily were still entitled to their shares in the company, but James had spent months positioning himself as the sole decision-maker. He leveraged their desperation, offering them a choice: sell their shares to him at a fair but firm price, or be left with nothing but a symbolic title. Given their financial situations, Mark drowning in personal debt and Emily unable to sustain her lifestyle without an income, they had no choice. They signed away their stakes in the company. With that, James became the sole owner of Carter Real Estate. The empire his father had built was now his alone. When the dust settled, his family tried, in their own ways, to rebuild their relationships with him. Margaret, humbled and regretful, visited him at his office one evening. "I know I can't change the past," she said quietly, "but I hope one day you can forgive me." James studied her for a long moment before responding. "I don't know if I can, Mom," he admitted, "but I appreciate the honesty." Emily disappeared from the public eye for a while, eventually finding work in a field she had never expected: event planning. It wasn't glamorous, but it allowed her to make use of the social skills she had honed over years of hosting parties. She never openly thanked James for saving the company, but deep down, she knew she owed him everything. Mark, however, refused to change. Bitter and resentful, he saw himself as a victim rather than the architect of his own downfall. He left the country for a while, chasing business opportunities overseas, but nothing he touched ever succeeded. Without his father's guidance or his family's wealth to protect him, he was just another failed business. And James? James had proven something, not just to his family, but to himself. He had built his success without them, and when they had come crawling back, he had taken control on his own terms. He had saved the company, but he had done it for himself, not for them. As he stood in his office, looking out over the city skyline, he felt no triumph, no gloating satisfaction, just a quiet certainty that he had done what needed to be done. His father's legacy was safe, but more importantly, James had built his own.